All right, get ready for a deep dive, everybody. Today we're going into the world of American English at work. Specifically, we're focusing on contracts and your rights. We'll be using Wikipedia's page on United States labor law to guide us. And let me tell you, it's a goldmine of info. So
Yeah.
perfect for learning English too, by the way.
Absolutely.
I'm Thomas, and I got to say, I'm pretty excited to dig into some of these historical bits about, how work in America evolved to what it is today. Fascinating stuff.
I'm Linda, and I agree it's a fascinating topic. U.S. labor law, let's face it, it can seem pretty overwhelming at first, like a jungle almost.
Yeah.
But don't worry, we're here to help you navigate it. We'll focus on what matters most to you, especially if you're, new to working in the U.S. We're going to connect the dots between the history of it all, contracts, your rights as a worker, and even throw in some key vocabulary along the way.
Yeah, and speaking of contracts, I think a lot of people kind of get confused about what exactly makes a contract legally binding here in the U.S.
Right.
So, it's just a casual agreement with my boss enough, or do I need something super official, all written up and signed and everything?
That's a great question, and it's where things get kind of interesting. You see, even just a spoken agreement, believe it or not, can actually be considered a contract.
Really?
Yeah, as long as both sides, understand and agree to the terms they're discussing. But here's the thing. U.S. law steps in to protect workers because, well, let's be real, there's often a power imbalance between a single employee and, a big company or employer.
Makes sense. So it's not just about what's officially written down.
Exactly. You have certain rights that cannot be ignored or just brushed aside, even if a contract tries to do that. We're talking about things like minimum wage, overtime pay, family leave, safety rules. Those are your rights, period. Think of them like a safety net or, a baseline for any agreement you make.
Ah, okay. I see, a connection for English learners here. It's kind of like grammar, right?
Ooh, tell me more.
You can write all sorts of creative sentences,
Yeah.
but you still got to follow those basic grammar rules. So I guess these rights are like the grammar of working in the U.S.
That's a brilliant analogy. And just like grammar rules can differ, between British and American English, labor laws can vary from state to state here in the U.S.
And speaking of which, the source we're looking at mentioned this phrase, laboratories of democracy, which I thought was pretty interesting. It's talking about how states experiment with different laws. That phrase is definitely going straight into my vocabulary notebook.
It's a good one. Laboratories of democracy. It really illustrates how some states go above and beyond those federal minimum standards, like, trying out new ideas and approaches. Now, another question that we get a lot is, who exactly are these laws protecting? And sometimes it's not as clear-cut as you might think.
Yeah, the Wikipedia page actually had some examples that kind of surprised me. Did you know that newsboys back in the early 20th century were considered employees, even though they didn't have traditional paychecks or anything?
Yeah.
And there was even this case about an 8-year-old boy who got injured while working.
Oh, wow.
And the court basically said, hold on, even though child labor is illegal, he's technically still considered an employee in this particular case. It just shows you how the law has to, grapple with all these different, sometimes really unusual situations.
Absolutely. And those cases really highlight how the concept of an employee can be broader than just, someone with a signed contract. It often comes down to how much control and dependence a worker has on the company they're working for.
Right. And that actually makes me think about all those debates happening right now about Uber drivers and whether they should be classified as independent contractors or employees.
Yeah.
I mean, it has huge implications for their rights and benefits.
Absolutely huge implications. And it brings up all these legal terms that we're going to be talking about, like vicarious liability, which basically means a company can be held responsible for the actions of its employees, even if the company didn't directly cause the issue. It's about, figuring out who ultimately holds the responsibility.
Ooh, vicarious. That's a good word to add to our vocabulary list.
I know.
Think of it like, those movies where the parents end up getting in trouble for their kids' pranks. It's kind of like that.
I like that.
It's all about who's really calling the shots. But let's get a bit more specific now about some of the key rights workers have in the U.S. What are some examples that our listeners should definitely be aware of, especially if they're new to working here?
Well, we've already mentioned minimum wage, which is obviously a big one.
Right.
But there's also this whole concept of overtime pay. Super important, especially if you're new to working in the U.S.
Okay.
The law states that if you work over 40 hours a week, you have to be paid time and a half for those extra hours.
Wait, time and a half? What does that even mean? I'm picturing Like some sort of magical spell from a fairy tale. Ha ha.
Haha. Yeah, it does sound a bit fantastical, doesn't it? But really, it just means 1.5 times your regular hourly rate.
Okay.
It's specifically for overtime, so if you work, more than those 40 hours in a week, you get paid time and a half for anything beyond that. Think of it like when athletes give 110%. You're going above and beyond, so your pay should reflect that.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm definitely writing that one down. What about other things employers might try to deduct from your paycheck? Like, are there any rules about that? Can they just take out whatever they want?
Actually, no, there are definite limits to that. For instance, they can't deduct for things that are considered customarily furnished to all employees.
Customarily furnished. Okay.
Yeah, think of things like uniforms or tools that you specifically need for the job. That cost should be on the company, not you. Now, there are rules about deducting for things like, housing or meals that the company might provide, but even then, they can't just deduct any random amount. There are specific regulations.
That's good to know. Now, something I've always heard is that the U.S. doesn't guarantee paid vacation time like some other countries do. Is that true?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. Unlike in Europe, where several weeks of paid vacation are just, standard practice, there's no federal law here in the U.S. that guarantees paid vacation time. So basically, it's mostly up to individual employers and what's in their, contracts or agreements with unions if they have them.
Right. But I think our source did mention a recent bill in Washington state that was trying to introduce paid leave.
Yeah. There have definitely been efforts to change things, but so far, nothing has passed at the federal level, which, is pretty different from how we got the weekend. Did you know the 2-day weekend wasn't always a thing in the U.S.?
Seriously? No way. Tell me more.
Yeah. It actually came about because workers fought for it.
Wow.
Through collective action and negotiations, not through laws passed by the government.
That's incredible. I love these little historical tidbits. It's perfect for our listeners who, love those unexpected bits of history. And it really shows how much power workers can have when they, work together towards a common goal.
It absolutely does. And that actually brings us to a really crucial aspect of U.S. labor law, the power of collective action through labor unions.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit for our English language learners.
Sure.
What exactly are labor unions? And why are they so important in the U.S.?
So a labor union, in the simplest terms, is a group of workers who come together to negotiate better conditions with their employers.
Okay.
And they have a lot more bargaining power as a group than any single worker would have on their own.
So it's all about strength in numbers.
Exactly. They negotiate what's called a collective agreement with the employer, which is basically a contract that covers things like wages, hours, working conditions, benefits for all the workers the union represents.
So what happens if, they can't agree? Does it just turn into like a big shouting match?
Not quite. That's where things like strikes and unfair labor practices come into play.
Ooh, those sound a bit intense. What do those words mean in this context?
So a strike is when workers collectively decide to refuse to work as a way of putting pressure on the employer.
Gotcha.
And unfair labor practices are actions that actually violate labor laws, either by the employer or by the union.
So there are, rules even for how they disagree.
Absolutely. Everything's got to be above board. For example, both sides have to engage in something called good faith bargaining, meaning they're genuinely trying to reach an agreement and not just, playing games or stalling the process. But of course, there are also those controversial issues within labor law that always spark debate. You might have heard of right-to-work laws, for example.
Oh, yeah, I have. Those seem to be pretty hotly debated. What's the main idea behind them?
Right-to-work laws basically allow workers in a unionized workplace to choose not to pay union dues, even though they still get to benefit from the union's negotiations.
Oh, interesting. So some people can get the benefits without actually contributing to the cost.
Exactly. And that's precisely why they're so controversial. Supporters of these laws argue that it's all about individual choice and freedom, while opponents argue that it weakens unions and ultimately ends up hurting all workers in the long run.
Wow. So there are strong arguments on both sides. Definitely a complex issue.
It definitely is. But understanding these different arguments and the vocabulary that surrounds them is really key to navigating the U.S. workplace. Plus, it's great for building up your English skills, too.
It's amazing how much history and, complexity is packed into these words, these seemingly simple words like employee or contract. For someone coming from a different country, it must feel like they're learning a whole new language within a language.
You're absolutely right. It's a whole other world, and that's actually something we want to focus on today for our listeners who are learning American English. Let's take some of those terms and phrases we've used and break them down a bit further, explaining not just what they mean, but how they're actually used in everyday conversations.
Okay, sounds good. Where should we start?
How about that phrase we mentioned earlier, laboratories of democracy? I know I've heard that before, but I'm not sure I ever fully grasped it.
Yeah, it's one of those phrases that sounds super smart, but you don't want to admit you don't really get it.
Uh-huh.
Re-
Exactly. Well, basically, it's a metaphor, right? It's comparing states in the U.S. to those, science labs where you can experiment with different policies to see what works best. You might hear people use it when they're discussing healthcare or education, even traffic laws, things like that.
So it's not just like limited to labor law.
No, it's a broader concept about how the U.S. system, allows for those variations at the state level, kind of like different approaches and all that. Okay, another term we use that might be a little tricky for English learners is vicarious liability. It's a mouthful, I know.
Definitely. But it's actually really important to understand, especially in a work context. Can you give us like a really clear explanation, maybe with an example or something?
Sure, so vicarious basically means being responsible for something that someone else did. Think of it this way. If your friend borrows your car and gets a speeding ticket, you might be held vicariously liable because it's your car.
Oh, that's a great example. So it's not that you were speeding, but you're still responsible because of your connection to the person who was.
Exactly. And in a workplace setting, this often comes up when an employee does something wrong while they're on the job. The employer might be held vicariously liable for that employee's actions. It's kind of a legal way of saying that the company is ultimately responsible for its workers, even if those workers messed up.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Okay, what about, time and a half? We were just talking about that. It doesn't sound very literal, does it?
Haha, it really doesn't. It makes me think of some kind of magical spell, like something you'd hear in a fairy tale.
I know, right?
But really, all it means is 1.5 times your regular hourly rate, and it's specifically used for overtime pay. So if you work, like we said, over 40 hours in a week, you got to be paid time and a half for those extra hours.
Okay, so it's like a little bonus for working extra hard.
Exactly, a little reward for all that effort. Okay, let's move on to another phrase we've been using, collective bargaining. This one's super important for understanding how unions work.
Yeah, it sounds very formal and serious. Like, break it down for us in simple terms.
Think of it like a negotiation, but on a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
So instead of one worker negotiating with their boss, the union comes in and negotiates on behalf of all the workers it represents, like a team effort.
Right, so it's like workers coming together to have a stronger voice.
Right. Precisely. The union becomes the voice of the workers, making sure their concerns are heard and their needs are met. And the result of that whole collective bargaining process is something called a collective agreement.
Ah, so that's where the agreement part comes in. It's not just a casual handshake deal.
Nope, it's a lot more official than that. We're talking about a formal, legally binding document that outlines the terms of employment for all the workers covered by that union.
Wow, this is fascinating stuff. We've already gone through like laboratories of democracy, vicarious liability, time and a half, collective bargaining, and now collective agreement. That's a whole vocabulary lesson right there.
And it's all within this specific context of U.S. labor law, which makes it even more relevant for English learners.
Absolutely.
By understanding these terms, you're not just expanding your vocabulary, you're also getting insights into how American society and workplaces actually operate.
It's like learning the language while simultaneously learning about the culture, the history, the whole shebang.
Exactly. But learning a language isn't just about memorizing words and phrases, right? It's about knowing how to use them effectively in different situations.
Right. So what are some like practical tips for our listeners who are trying to improve their English, particularly when it comes to talking about things like work and their rights?
Well, one of the most important things is to actively listen to how native speakers use those words and phrases.
Okay.
Pay attention to the context, the tone they use, their body language, all those subtle cues that contribute to the meaning.
So it's all about like learning by immersion, being surrounded by the language and kind of absorbing it naturally.
Exactly. Another tip is to actually practice speaking and writing using those new words and phrases you're learning. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. Honestly, that's how you learn.
Yeah, everyone makes mistakes. It's part of the process.
Exactly. And don't be shy about asking questions if you're not sure about something.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Curiosity is key to learning a language. And remember, there are so many resources available to help you. You've got online dictionaries, language exchange apps, even watching movies and TV shows can be super helpful.
Oh yeah, I've learned so much from watching sitcoms. They're great for picking up like everyday slang and those common expressions. But it's also important to find resources that are specific to your field, like labor law in this case.
Absolutely. Reading articles, listening to podcasts like this one, attending webinars, all those things can help you get familiar with the specific vocabulary you need to succeed in your chosen field.
Right. And of course, don't forget to practice, practice, practice. The more you use the language, the more confident and fluent you'll become.
Couldn't agree more. It's like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Love that analogy. Now, we've been talking a lot about labor unions and collective bargaining, but are there other ways for workers to come together and advocate for their rights? Like, what if someone doesn't want to join a union?
That's a great question. And you're right. While unions are a powerful force, there are definitely other forms of worker organizations and advocacy groups out there in the U.S.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not just a black and white, you must join a union kind of situation. There are things called worker centers, for example, which provide support and resources to workers regardless of their union status. And then you have those industry-specific associations and professional organizations that specifically advocate for workers' rights within, certain fields.
That's good to know. It sounds like there are multiple paths that workers can take to make their voices heard. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Exactly. And these different groups often collaborate and work together to address, bigger, broader issues like wage inequality or workplace safety or discrimination.
Right. So it's really about finding the right fit for you and your specific situation.
Absolutely. And even if you're not directly involved in these organizations, just staying informed about their work and the issues they're tackling is really important for understanding the whole landscape of worker rights in the U.S.
It's like being an informed citizen, but specifically in the workplace.
Precisely. It gives you the knowledge to make informed decisions and to contribute to positive change.
I like that. All this talk about, worker rights and collective action makes me think about those historical figures we mentioned earlier, Eugene Debs and Cesar Chavez. What were their stories again?
Ah, yes, them. Those two individuals played really pivotal roles in shaping the landscape of worker rights here in the U.S. They were both incredibly passionate advocates for social justice and labor rights, and their stories are truly inspiring, I have to say.
Yeah, for those listeners who might not be familiar with them, can you give us a little overview of who they were and what they fought for?
Of course. So Eugene Debs was a labor leader and socialist politician back in the early 20th century. He had a really powerful voice advocating for things like better wages, safer working conditions, and the right to unionize.
Yeah.
He even ran for president 5 times, if you can believe it.
Wow.
And all while facing, immense opposition and even imprisonment for his beliefs.
That's incredible. Sounds like a true revolutionary.
He really was. And then you have Cesar Chavez, a labor leader and civil rights activist who dedicated his life to fighting for the rights of farm workers, particularly in the mid-20th century.
Okay.
He actually co-founded the United Farm Workers Union and led all sorts of protests and movements, boycotts, strikes, hunger strikes, to bring attention to those harsh conditions faced by so many farm workers, many of whom were immigrants, by the way.
His story feels particularly relevant today, given all those ongoing debates about immigration and the rights of undocumented workers.
Absolutely. Chavez's legacy is a powerful reminder that the fight for worker rights is often deeply intertwined with the fight for social justice and equality for everyone, regardless of their background.
Their stories are truly inspiring, and they really show how individuals, through their courage and determination, can spark real change.
Yes, and they also highlight the importance of collective action, right?
Yeah.
Debs and Chavez didn't achieve their victories single-handedly. They mobilized and organized entire groups of workers to fight for their rights together.
It's a reminder that we're stronger together,
Right.
and that our voices have more impact when we unite for a common cause.
Wouldn't have said it better myself. And their stories continue to resonate today, inspiring new generations of activists and advocates to fight for a more just and equitable world. It's a legacy that lives on.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground, starting from those basics of contracts and worker rights, and then delving into the nuances of labor law vocabulary, and then hearing those inspiring stories about those historical figures who fought so hard for a better future for workers.
Yeah, it's been a true deep dive into the world of American English at work, and I hope our listeners are walking away feeling a little more empowered, a little more knowledgeable with the vocabulary and the insights they need to navigate this often complex landscape.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up completely, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners, especially those who are still on that journey of learning English?
My advice is to embrace the journey. Learning a language, it's a lifelong process full of challenges and rewards along the way. Embrace those mistakes you make, celebrate the little victories, and never stop exploring the richness and complexity of the English language.
That's fantastic advice. And remember, there's so many resources out there to support you on this journey. Online dictionaries, language exchange partners, podcasts like ours, books, movies. The possibilities are endless.
That's right. And don't underestimate the power of real world experiences. Talking to people, reading signs, listening to music, all those things contribute to your learning.
It's all about immersing yourself in the language and the culture, really getting a feel for it.
Precisely. And most importantly, have fun.
Yeah.
Learning a language should be an enjoyable experience full of discovery and excitement, not just a chore.
I couldn't agree more. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into American English at work. We hope you found it informative and insightful, maybe even a little bit inspiring.
And we hope you'll join us again next time for another deep dive into language, culture, and the world around us.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've gone from those fundamental building blocks of work in America, contracts and those essential rights that protect every worker, all the way to some pretty complex vocabulary. It's perfect for those who are learning English and, trying to figure out how things work in the U.S. workplace.
Absolutely. It's all about empowering you, the listener. We want you to understand the rules of the game, so to speak, but also to feel confident playing it, both in terms of your job and your language skills. It's all connected.
So to kind of wrap things up here, what are those key takeaways that you really want our listeners to walk away with? What are the biggies?
Okay, so first and foremost, remember that contracts in the U.S., they're not just about that fine print. Your rights as a worker are actually protected by law. It's like the safety net that's always there no matter what your individual agreement says.
Yeah, it's like having those basic grammar rules like we talked about, always backing you up, even when you're trying to use those more complex words and phrases.
Exactly. Okay, second takeaway. Knowing how you're classified as a worker is super crucial. Are you considered an employee or are you an independent contractor? That distinction can really make a big difference in terms of which rights and protections apply to you.
Yeah, and it's not always obvious. We saw those examples of, the newsboys and even that young boy being classified as employees, even in those unexpected situations. It can be a bit tricky.
It can. It just highlights how the law sometimes looks beyond just job titles and those official papers. Okay, and the final takeaway, I'd say, is never underestimate the power of collective action. Whether it's through those traditional labor unions or other kinds of advocacy groups, workers definitely have a stronger voice when they come together and, speak as one.
It's like that old saying, united we stand, divided we fall. And it's a theme that we see throughout U.S. labor history, right?
Oh, absolutely. From those early fights for things like the weekend to those movements led by figures like, Debs and Chavez that we talked about, collective action has been a huge factor in securing those rights that workers enjoy today.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to see how those historical struggles have helped pave the way for a better future.
It shows that change is possible even when you're facing really powerful opposition. You just got to keep pushing for it.
So for our listeners who are out there thinking, okay, this is all interesting, but what does it actually mean for me personally? What would you say is the big picture message here?
It's about empowerment, plain and simple. Knowing your rights, understanding how the system works, and having the language skills to advocate for yourself. Those are the tools you need to succeed in the U.S. workplace and to feel confident doing it.
And it goes beyond just work.
Yeah.
Right? It's about being an informed and engaged citizen.
100%. The workplace, it's like a microcosm of society as a whole. It reflects all those broader social, economic, and political forces that are at play.
And understanding those forces through the lens of language and history, that's what makes these deep dives so valuable, in my opinion.
Couldn't agree more. Now, we've spent all this time talking about the U.S. model, which makes sense. That's where we are. But it's worth taking a step back and thinking, are there other systems out there that might be worth exploring? Could the U.S. learn from how other countries do things?
That's a fantastic point. We talked about those laboratories of democracy in the context of different states, but what about looking beyond U.S. borders, expanding our horizons a bit?
Exactly. Some European countries have these really interesting models of worker participation, for example. They give employees a much stronger voice in those big company decisions. Some even have worker representatives on their corporate boards.
Wow, that sounds pretty radical compared to, the typical U.S. approach.
It is a different way of thinking about the relationship between labor and capital, for sure.
It brings up all sorts of questions, doesn't it? About power dynamics, democracy in the workplace, the role of workers in shaping their own destinies.
Absolutely. Those are definitely questions worth exploring further. Maybe in a future deep dive, we can take a closer look at some of those alternative models.
Ooh, I'm already intrigued.
Yeah.
But for now, I think we've given our listeners a really solid foundation in U.S. labor law with all those essential English vocabulary terms and, some food for thought about the history of it all.
I hope so. We always encourage our listeners to use these deep dives as a starting point, a springboard for their own learning and exploration. It's just the beginning.
Exactly. Check out that Wikipedia page we used. Do your own research. Follow those threads of curiosity wherever they take you. It's all about learning and growing.
And please share your thoughts with us. Leave a comment on our YouTube channel. Tell us what you learned, what other topics you'd like us to explore in future deep dives. We're always listening.
We love hearing from you. And while you're there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of those future episodes.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those English skills sharp.
Happy learning, everyone!